Part 2 of Brother I'm Dying by Edwige Danticat. For adversity. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Proverbs 17:17. Chapter 11 is titled, Brother I Can Speak. In the summer of 1983, when I was 14 and Bob was 12 years old, Uncle Joseph came to New York for a medical checkup. Knowing that we couldn't wait to see him, my father took Bob and me to the airport to meet him. My mother had insisted that we wear our crisply ironed new clothes, a bright orange sundress for me and a pair of dress pants and an immaculate white t-shirt for Bob. It seemed to me that my parents wanted my uncle to see us at our best, perhaps even to show him that they were taking good care of us, that they'd washed the proverbial part of us that he and Tante Denise might have left dirty. As we stood in the waiting area, I shifted my weight nervously, all the while wondering whether my uncle wanted to see us as much as we wanted to see him. Emerging from customs and immigration, Uncle Joseph looked slightly different than I remembered. He'd gained some weight, and his rounded belly made him appear shorter. Bob and I both ran to him and wrapped our arms around his body. I was nearly as tall as he was now, and it felt odd to reach his shoulder, to look him so easily in his eye. He tapped our faces and smiled, then pointing to our father, who was standing a few feet away, walked over to say hello. My father wrapped his arms around my uncle's shoulders, embracing him. Then he took a few steps back to formally shake his hand. Grabbing Uncle Joseph's suitcase, Papa commented that it was heavy. "I'll let Bob take care of it," my father said. "He's nearly a man now." My uncle nodded and put his hands together, confirming that it was a good idea. The suitcase had a long strap, and our father handed it to Bob, who, gawky but strong, pulled it forward easily. As Bob managed the bag, I found myself walking between Uncle Joseph and my father, with both their arms around me, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "How's Denise?" my father asked. My uncle mouthed, "Auntie Jean malade." I was amazed that I could still read his lips more easily than my father could. "What did he say?" asked my father. "Tante Denise is a bit sick," I said. "She functions," my uncle mouthed, "but struggles with the diabetes, and now her blood pressure is high too, like mine." "Why don't you bring her here to see a doctor here?" my father asked. "Li pavel," my uncle said. "She doesn't want to," I said to my father. "She relies heavily on her herbs," my uncle said, "her country medicine." It was a humid afternoon. When we reached my father's cab, Bob, sweating, stopped and waited for Papa to open the trunk. I stepped aside, joining Bob by the car. My father paused and looked into my uncle's eyes. "Do you see your children?" My father blurted out, as though he'd been waiting a long time to say it. "Do you see how much they've grown?" My father decided it was best that I take my uncle to his appointment at Kings County Hospital the next day. Unlike anyone else, I could now doubly interpret my uncle, both from silence to voice and Creole to English. Sitting next to him in the packed waiting room of the ear, nose, and throat clinic, with the glossy posters of decaying necks and lungs looming over us, I saw his cancer come to life in the men and women around us. Some, like him, had radical laryngectomies and couldn't speak at all. Others had partial laryngectomies and spoke in breathless whispers by pressing fingertips against various points along the neck. Leaning forward to listen, my uncle seemed to envy those in the latter category their ability to make some of their basic wishes known, even though they could no longer carry on long conversations. After examining my uncle, the doctor, a young blond man with a cherubic round face and a bowl-shaped mop of hair, pulled out a sausage-sized machine and placed it in my uncle's hand. "Tell him," the doctor said, "that this is a voice box, an artificial larynx, something that can amplify his whispers and allow people to hear and understand him." My doctor placed his hand on my uncle's fingers and helped him form a fist around the machine. Then he guided it to a spot above my uncle's gullet and told him to speak. "Speak?" my uncle asked. The machine buzzed, letting out a clamor of static. The doctor moved my uncle's hand a few inches and then said again, "Speak." My Uncle Joseph opened his mouth and tried to utter a few words, but no sound came out. The doctor moved his hand a few more inches, then asked, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" "Z," he said, "eggs." The sound of the word emerging out of his own body in a robotic monotone seemed to shock my uncle, who raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Keep talking," the doctor said. "What would you like to have for dinner?" "I don't know," Uncle Joseph said, the mechanical voice a bit clearer now. His face lit up. He smiled, baring nearly all of his false teeth. "Where can we buy it?" he asked. The artificial larynx was sold in a medical supplies store near the hospital. After the doctor's visit, we went there and got one. Later that afternoon, when we returned to my parents' apartment, my mother had not yet come back from her job in the textile factory, but my father was there, sitting on the blue plastic-covered sofa in the living room and sifting through his mail while occasionally glancing at the television set, which Bob, Kelly, and Carl were watching from the floor. Uncle Joseph turned off the television, causing the boys to silently protest with grimaces. He walked over and sat down next to my father, signaling for them also to pay attention. "I was worried," my father said. "I thought they'd kept you in the hospital." The plastic squealed under my uncle as he leaned even closer to my father. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the voice box and raised it to his neck. The machine screeched with static when he turned it on. Uncle Joseph adjusted the volume, then pressed it more deeply at the curve between his chin and neck. "Mira, I can speak," my uncle said, drawing out each mechanized word. The boys rushed over to the sofa, circling my uncle. My father pushed his face closer to my uncle's. His eyes widened as he looked into my uncle's mouth, dumbfounded. "How's it happening?" he asked. "It must be a miracle," my uncle said. "What else can it be?" "Science," my father absentmindedly offered. "Science is God's way of shielding miracles," Uncle Joseph replied. My father took my uncle's hand and led him to a lamp in a corner of the room so he could better see the machine and its interaction with my uncle's neck. This was their first two-sided conversation in many years, and they both seemed to want to move it past the technicalities to a point of near normalcy. "How does it sound to your ear?" my father asked. "How does it sound to yours?" my uncle countered. My father paused to think, searching perhaps for the most tactful and encouraging description of what he was hearing. "It sounds like yon robo," he replied, "a robot." My father was trying to be more exact than heartening. My uncle was not fazed. "To my ear," my uncle said, "it sounds like two voices, my own voice inside my head and the one you hear. I know that voice is going to sound strange to people." He was smiling now, showing all of his false teeth. "But it's better than not speaking at all." That summer, when my uncle went back to Haiti, he sold his first house, the one Bob and I and everyone else in the family had lived in with him and Tante Denise. The house was beginning to fall apart, and since everyone had left, it felt too large for just Tante Denise and him. He then built a small 3-bedroom apartment for Tante Denise and himself in the courtyard behind the school and church. He also got a home telephone on which he used to call us often. Sometimes I'd call him just to say hello, which felt like a miracle unto itself. At first I'd say, "Can you believe we're talking to each other?" And he'd say, "Can you?" But after a few minutes, as he caught me up on things, his life, Tante Denise, political news from Haiti, his voice seemed no more unusual than mine or anyone else's. He was expanding his work, he said, adding to the school and church in Bel Air a clinic that was run by Marie Micheline. Marie Micheline had left her job as head nurse at the other neighborhood clinic and was now helping him with his work. They were together more than ever. She was 37 years old, but from the pictures I saw of her, looked no older than she did at 22. She'd had 3 boys after Ruth, with 2 men who, as my uncle put it, again had not loved her enough. I often imagined myself all grown up and my father talking about me in the same forgiving way that my uncle talked about Marie Micheline. Perhaps because he had rescued her not once but twice, he loved her even more deeply, more unconditionally. After he left for Cuba, Marie Micheline's biological father had never contacted them, prompting Tante Denise to call her their Moses girl. She was their baby, but unlike Tante Denise, who thought Marie Micheline was spoiled, Uncle Joseph thought she could do no wrong. "She needs to realize she's not a girl playing with boys anymore," Tante Denise would say, even after Marie Micheline had had 4 children. "She attracts bad, just like she did Pressoir," Uncle Joseph would say, "but she's not a bad person." On February 7th, 1986, my uncle's 63rd birthday, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier fled Haiti for France, leaving a military junta in charge of the country. The junta, which ruled for 2 years, was led by an ambitious army officer, Lieutenant General Henri Namfi. A new president, Leslie Magnac, was sworn in on February 7th, 1988, my uncle's 65th birthday. Because Baby Doc's departure had taken place on February 7th, my uncle's birthday had become the official date for Haitian presidential inaugurations and swearings-in. 4 months after he was inaugurated, Leslie Magnac was ousted by Lieutenant General Namfi. Soon, Namfi was himself deposed by a military rival, General Prosper Avro. In April 1989, a group of former Tonton Macoute and hardline Duvalier loyalists tried to topple Avril in a failed coup, creating hostilities within the army. The battle between the opposing military factions came to Bel Air one April afternoon when one group chased the other to Rue Tirmacé and the wrought iron gate of the church clinic. Marie Micheline was sitting alone behind her desk looking through some notes she'd scribbled on the 20 or so patients she'd seen that day. They were all minor cases for once, mostly cuts and scrapes, and 2 infants with low-grade fevers. She'd not had to send anyone to the public hospital. She was probably just reaching over to slip the files into a small metal cabinet beside her when she heard one gunshot followed by a volley of bullets. Looking up, she would have seen a whirl of camouflage racing past the open metal gate. At this point, she may have thought of the 40 people who, according to newspaper reports, had died that week, caught in the crossfire of such battles all over Port-au-Prince. She may have thought of Ruth or her 3 young sons, Pochon, Marc, and Ronald, who were due back from school at any time. She may have thought of Tante Denise, to whom she was to give an insulin shot in a few minutes. Of Uncle Joseph, whose blood pressure she also monitored daily at the same time. She got up from her desk and ran to the gate, hoping to close it before one of the soldiers barged in. But what if someone needed her help? And how would she feel if Ruth, Pochon, Marc, or Ronald was shot because the gate was closed and they couldn't come in? Neighbors saw her standing in the doorway with beads of sweat gathering on her forehead. Then a bullet whizzed by, bouncing off the gate with a spark. The street was suddenly blurry, a cloud of dust descending in the wake of speeding military pickups. Had she been shot? In the heart? She clutched her chest and fell to the floor. She never regained consciousness. Because Ron Howell, a New York journalist, happened to be covering the military shootout in Bel Air that afternoon, Marie Micheline's death was the subject of a Newsday article published on April 17, 1989. Headlined, "Haiti Still Struggling to Shine," it was printed next to a color photograph of her funeral procession slowly winding through downtown Port-au-Prince. Marie Micheline, wrote Howell, was in many ways a reflection of Haiti and its potential, a flicker of light, frustrated in its attempt to shine. When you hear that someone has died whom you've not seen in a long time, it's not too difficult to pretend that it hasn't really happened, that the person is continuing to live just as she was before, in your absence, out of your sight. The last day of Marie Micheline's funeral, when I spoke to my uncle on the phone, I experienced the biggest failing of his new voice. Like distance, it masked pain. Still, his pauses were like sobs, the expansion and contraction of his words mechanical traces of sorrow. That night I told my uncle a story that I had just remembered myself, of being 8 years old and carrying a note home from school requesting that my parent or guardian come to my class to spank me because I hadn't finished all of my homework. That afternoon when I got home, I'd given Marie Micheline the note, thinking that she'd go a lot easier on me than either my uncle or Tante Denise. However, the next morning when she went to school, Marie Micheline took Mademoiselle Sagnon, my very tall, slim, and prim teacher, aside, and under an almond tree in the corner of the bustling recess yard whispered in her ear for 5 minutes. "What did you tell her?" I asked Marie Micheline as she walked me back to class with a broad smile on her face. I gripped her soft, small hands, unable to imagine them pounding me with the stiff cow leather whip, the rigwas, with which parents and teachers often thrash their children's behinds or palms. I'm going to take care of her and the entire family at the neighborhood clinic for a year, she said. They'll never have to wait and they'll never have to pay. For that, she won't send anyone in your class home with spanking letters for a month. Just a month, I asked. That's the best I could do, she said. Her own children, my uncle said at the end of my story. How can 4 children lose their mother in an instant like that? Fearful of losing them too, he was going to try and get a visa for Ruth and the boys to join some of Marie Michelin's biological mother's relatives who are now living in Canada. Before she was buried, a coroner was determined that Marie Michelin died from a heart attack. But when I spoke to Tante Denise, who cried as though she were hollering to the heavens in protest, she said that no one could convince her of a simpler truth, that watching the bullets fly, the violence of her neighborhood, the rapid unraveling of her country, Marie Michelin had been frightened to death.